I had a doctor's appointment this morning, and Joel had a doctor's appointment this morning, and when he came out, he called me and he said, "What'd your doctor say?" I said, "No, I got a good report." "What'd your doctor say?" He said, "I got a good report." And I thought, God, this is what old people do. They compare
Funny,
notes for their doctor's appointment.
funny. Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you're well. Today is today is Wednesday. It is the 17th of December, and we're getting ready for Parshas Miketz, and that's also going to be Shabbos Chanukah. So I want to share some ideas that I think will resonate with all of us for both of these occasions for both Miketz and for Shabbos Chanukah. So let's jump right in. Right at the beginning of the parsha, in fact, the first words of the parsha, the first verse, the opening verse of the parsha, it tells us Vayimi Ketz Nasaim Yamim. It came to pass at the end of 2 full years, Uparo Cholem, Paro was dreaming, V'nei Omed Ala Yor, and he was standing at the Nile. So what are these 2 years? It says basically 2 years has passed from, sometimes when you would see a TV show or a movie would say it would pick it up and say when we last saw our hero, and then they would show you, just to remind you what was going on. So what does this mean? The 2 years have passed. So it's obviously talking about 2 years have passed from the incident when Yosef was in jail with the chief butler and the chief baker. So that was at the end of Parshas Vayeshev. So let's just look back at this. The last psukim that were in the previous parsha in Vayeshev. So if you remember, the Yosef had found himself in prison, and he was there because the wife of Potiphar had made all sorts of accusations against him. And even despite his innocence, he was thrown into jail. And when he was in jail, you couldn't keep him down. He immediately rose to a position of prominence, and the jail keepers put him in charge of everybody there. And he notices one day that the chief butler and the chief baker are very sad, and they tell him that they've had these dreams. He interprets their dreams, and he tells the butler that you are going to get your job back. The baker, unfortunately, was going to be executed, but the butler was going to get his job back. And he said, "Do me a favor, when you get back in your position of power, mention me to Paro." So again, just let's look at those verses again from last week's Parsha. So you'll see it there on page 1. It's chapter 40. So it's 14 and 15 we'll start at. Is that he put in the request with the butler, Ki'im zachartani yitcha, can you please remember me when things go well for you? Kasher yitavlach, when things go in your direction. Basisa noimadi chesed, do kindness for me. Vis kartani al paro, mention me to Paro. Votzeisani mi beis min habayis hazeh, and that he will get me out of this place. In other words, I want to get out of jail. So what I interpreted your dream. You're going to go free when you get back to your position of prominence with Paro. Put in a good word for me. Tesvav ki gunov ganavti me'eretz Avrayim, because I was stolen from the land of the Hebrews. V'gam polo asisi mumo, and even here in Egypt, I've done nothing wrong. Ki samosi babor, yet they put me in this dungeon. Okay, how did that play out? So the last 4 verses in Parshas Vayeshev, we're going to look at Chaf through Chaf Beis. Bibi Yom HaShlishi was on the third day. Yom Uledes is Paro, was Paro's birthday. Vayas Mishtel Chol Avadav. He made a massive feast, a banquet for all of his officers, his servants. Vayisas Rosh Sarah Mashkim, and he counted, and he counted the chief cupbearer, the butler, and also the chief baker, and he basically is doing a roll call, and he says, "Where's my chief baker? Where's my chief butler?" So they restored the chief cupbearer, the chief butler was put back in his position, and he continued his role of serving Paro his drinks. Chav Beis 22, and he executed the chief baker just like Yosef had interpreted. Now, what happened to Yosef's whole idea of putting in a lifeline with the butler, asking him to put in a good word for him? The pasuk ended by saying, the chief butler did not remember Yosef at all. He totally forgot about him. So then this parsha begins, that it was 2 years later. So 2 years after having been forgotten about by the chief butler, that's when these events start to play themselves out. That Paro has a dream. It's bothering him. No one's offering him an interpretation he likes. And finally, the butler comes forward and he says, "You know what? I'm going to remind you of my previous crimes. I was once in jail, and while I was there was this Hebrew lad who did a great job of interpreting dreams. So that's when it is. So 2 years later, that's when this guy finally puts in a good word for Yosef. So Chazal, our sages, pick up on this, and you'll see there's a Rashi on the bottom of page 1. And Rashi here is not saying this on his own; he's actually quoting the Medrash. And he says, what was with this 2 years? So it says, Vaishkacheyu, it says that chief butler had totally forgotten about Yosef after he got let out of jail. Lachar mikam. Afterwards, meaning as soon as he became free, he totally forgot about Yosef. So now the Medrash wants to say, Chazal were struggling with, why did Yosef deserve this? Why did Yosef deserve to spend an extra 2 years in jail? So it says, Mipnei shetalabo Yosef l'zcharo. Since Yosef had relied on this butler to remember him, huskach lios asur shtei shanim. That's why God said, I'm going to almost punish you, that you got to spend another 2 years in jail. And that's how Miketz begins, that after 2 years, that's when the events unfold, with Paro having this dream, not happy with any interpretations, and the butler suggests Yosef. So why did Yosef spend an extra 2 years in jail? So Chazal say it's a complaint on Yosef, is that he put too much hope in that butler. Shenemar, because he bases this on a verse in Tehillim, Ashrei Hagever, praised is the person, Asher Sam Hashem Iftacho, places his trust in God, V'lo Pana El Rehavim, and he does not turn himself to these lowlifes. Rehavim could mean haughty people, but people with terrible character trees, people of disrepute, does not put his faith in people of disrepute, V'lo Batach Al Mitzrim, so that the verse, the way Chazal saw it, is almost being critical of Yosef, that he depended on Egyptians, Hakrim Rahav, who are elsewhere are referred to as haughty or as people of disrepute. So what it seems as if a simple reading of this Rashi is that Yosef was punished. Heaven was upset. Hashem was upset at Yosef. Is that things are going in your favor? You clearly see that I'm working with you. And what did you do? You turned to this butler and you put your hopes in the butler that he should be involved in springing you from prison. So because of that, Yosef's got to spend an extra 2 years in jail. Now, the question that's on this, the obvious question that's on this, is what did Yosef do wrong? We're not supposed to sit back and just say, God, make me a millionaire. There's that old joke about the guy who's praying every day with such intensity, make me a millionaire, make me, nothing ever happens. And finally, a heavenly voice rings out and says, why don't you buy a ticket? Buy a lottery ticket. You keep asking me to make you a millionaire, but you haven't done anything on your part to make it. I don't just do open miracles and help people. We have to put in our human efforts. Correct. The fellow whose whole town is drowning, and he's up on his roof saying, no, I trust in God. And a rowboat comes by and says, nope, I'm working with God. A Coast Guard comes, I'm working with God. And then another boat, I'm working with God. And finally he drowns. He gets up to the pearly gates. And he says, God, where were you? He says, I sent 3 boats. Why didn't you? So again, we are trained that there's this concept called hishtadlus, that we have to put in our human effort. So if we have to put in our human effort, seemingly that's exactly what Yosef was doing. He was turning to the butler saying, hey, you're going to get sprung from prison. You're going to get back in your position. Can you put in a good word for me with Paro? So why is he being held accountable for this? So the answer that I had always heard to this, and we'll see this, and I think that a lot of people offered this answer, is that you're right, Yosef, you have to put in your efforts, but the people you picked were rehavim, they were lowlifes. They're not people you could depend on. That's like grasping at straws. If this would have been some reputable person, then of course that would have been fine. But you're dealing with rehavim, and that's what the pasuk in Tehillim says: "Is Asher Hagever Asher Samiv Tachob Hashem." That praises a person who puts their faith in Hashem, v'lo pana al rehavim, and doesn't turn to people with in disrepute. A regular human being, an upstanding citizen, would have been fine, but you're dealing with rehavim. These aren't who you should be working with. So that's the way that I've seen the most straightforward solution to this quandary. I want to share with you though today another solution that I chanced upon this week. So this is from Rav Moshe Sternbach of Yerushalayim, and he gives a couple different answers to this question. We're going to see one of them. So we're on page 2. It says Vayimi Ketch Nasam Yamim, that Yosef had to spend these extra 2 years in jail. So he says, so again, he's struggling with the problem that all our commentators struggle with. He said, what did Yosef do wrong? We're supposed to put in our efforts. So he says, V'od nira, here's another approach that he says to answer this. Sheishtadlus zudi Yosef isal saramashkis vaday mutaris. Of course, it was absolutely fine. It was fine. Hishtadlus means putting in our human efforts. It was fine for Yosef to put his human efforts in with this butler. Gamut Tzaddik Yosef. Even if you're as righteous as Yosef, you've got to put in your efforts. You can't just sit back and say, God, make me a millionaire without buying a ticket. You've got to put in your efforts. So what did Yosef do wrong? El shecheto, what was Yosef's sin? Shesam iftacho b'saramashkim, shedarcho tavo Yeshua, is that he lost perspective. Yes, he should have asked the Saramashkim to put in a good word for Paro. But then he has to remember, what role is the Saramashkim? What role is the butler playing? He's just the conduit to, hopefully, my salvation is ultimately going to come through God. But I'm doing my part. I have to put in my effort, and that's my effort, is to turn to him. But ultimately, it's all coming from God. In his moment of desperation, feeling in jail, it seems as if what he's suggesting here is that Yosef lost that perspective. And Yosef really said, okay, that guy is going to spring me out of jail. Not that he's just my conduit to let God. Ultimately, God's going to do it, but I have to just put in my efforts, and he's my effort. That's what his attitude should have been. But ultimately, he forgot that that's his attitude, should be his attitude. His attitude becomes, that's my ticket. He's my ticket to freedom. He's not my ticket to freedom. God's my ticket to freedom. He's just, I got to be Yotzei. I've got to fulfill my obligation of doing my ishtadlus. He's the guy I'm working with. That's what his attitude should have been. And it seems as if in his moment of desperation, he lost that perspective. That's how he's going to frame it here. So he says, oh, what was Yosef's sin? That he honestly put all of his trust in this butler, that because of him, that's why he'll be saved. He's my ticket to freedom. But that's not the true perspective. God really does want. God wants us to do our effort. But a person's mindset has to be, when we're doing our effort, that my actions I'm doing, there's no guarantee and there's no reason to believe that my actions are the cause of everything that's going to happen. God's got any number of ways that he can help me. But my obligation is to do my effort, and now that'll allow God to help me. But to lose that perspective and think that no, it's all on me. It's all on my efforts. If I don't do it exactly in this route, the Yeshua is not going to come. That's not true. My obligation is to put in effort and put in responsible effort. Ultimately, now God's going to take it from there. It seems like he's suggesting Yosef lost sight of that. Yosef lost sight of the fact that ultimately his help and his ticket to freedom is coming from God. He really thought it's the Saramashkim who's going to do this for him. That it's through him that I'll become free. He's my ticket to freedom. That's why he was punished, given 2 years. So there was nothing intrinsically wrong with asking the Saramashkim for help. What was wrong was what his attitude should be. In other words, he lost perspective. The perspective should have been that, yes, I have an obligation to do my part, but ultimately it's God who's going to get me saved, and there's any number of ways that could happen. But Yosef, in his desperation, said, this is my ticket to freedom, and that's how I'm going to be saved. He's my salvation. It's not true. He lost perspective on it. That's what he's suggesting. Now he says here, Umaisa Ra'isi. I once saw, probably read, an incredible story. Eitzel Mori Rabbi Agrover Meir Shapiro. Meir Shapiro, remember, was the founder of the Daf Yomi program, but he also had that yeshiva, great big yeshiva in Lublin, in Poland. So he says, I read an incredible story about Rav Meir Shapiro of Lublin. Shesholach Avrech, he once sent out a young man from the yeshiva, Lasov Kesef Yeshiva, so to go on a fundraising mission to collect money for the yeshiva. Shenimtza b'matzav dachok mod. That was in a really pressing economic concern at that point. B'yav she'avrech torach v'yaga harbe. And even though that young man worked so hard, he went to every town, he met with all the potential donors, lo ala biyado mu'uma. He didn't have results. He didn't come back with a bag full of cash. He didn't come back with any pledges or checks. And then out of nowhere, suddenly out of nowhere, out of left field, some philanthropist shows up and he makes an incredible donation to the yeshiva. So then what happened? Rav Meir Shapiro hurries up. Lohodos la'avrech. He goes to thank that fundraiser who had gone on the failed fundraising mission. B'chamimos yisera, with all sorts of extra warmth. Shebizchuso nitzla yeshiva. And he says, it's because of you that the yeshiva was saved from economic ruin. But then this young man answers, why are you thanking me? I have no connection with that philanthropist. He was not on my list of potential donors. I never spoke to him. I never met him. There's no connection. We never crossed paths. Analo Moreno Rabbeinu. So then Rav Meir Shapiro says to him, no, you got it all wrong. The main thing is we have to put our efforts. So through you, the Yeshiva Chachmei Lublin did our efforts. You may have gone to, I don't know, pick a city. You may have gone to Frankfurt and you had no luck there. And this philanthropist came from Paris, but it was because you put in your efforts that Hashem sent that philanthropist. In other words, you did our ishtadlus. That's why he's thanking him. The main thing is we have to put in our efforts. Once a human puts in their efforts, lamana yeshiva, you put in your efforts to raise money for the yeshiva. Then God did his part. To see to it that we would get our funds through this other person. It doesn't always translate into, don't think that just because you went to this city, that's where the funds now have to come from. You did your ishtadlus. The ishtadlus was, you put in your efforts to try to raise funds. So it would be nice if you saw that those people you approached actually responded and wrote you checks. It doesn't have to happen that way. We have to do our ishtadlus, and then God sends his agents to make things work. And that's what happened. You did your work in Frankfurt. The check came from Paris. That's fine. It makes perfect sense. And this is such an important concept when it comes to having faith and trust in God. Leida, we have to know Shakadosh Baruch Hu Hanosein. God is the ultimate giver. God's the one who blesses us with success. Ugezera milfanav shenishtadel. It's just a decree that he put out that we have to put in our efforts. Don't ever make the mistake of thinking that our hatzala, our salvation, came directly as a result of our hishtadlus, as a result of our efforts. It's not that my efforts caused this. My efforts unlocked, so to say, the vault that now God could bless us with success. But it's so in a sense, it's a result of our efforts, but not the way we think it. Because of my efforts, God was able to bless us with success. But it's not that my efforts was a direct, was a directive. That's how he's framing this. And I couldn't help but think of this as Chanukah, because every day in Chanukah, when we say our Shemona Esrei, and if we had a meal that required us to wash for bread and then to bench, we say Al Anisim. If we take the time to look at Al Anisim, how the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, when they set this up, how the words that they said and that they put into Al Anisim is totally reflective of this. Look what we're doing. Al Anisim is all about thanking God for the miraculous battle of the Chashmonaim against the Yevanim, a war that no one would have bet on the Jews in that war. Yeah, look at the words in the Al Anisim. We give total credit to God. This is all about saying, yeah, we did our part, and then you blessed us. Look at the words. Al Anisim v'ala porkan. We're thanking God for the miracles and the salvation. Ala gvuros, for the might. V'ala teshuos, and for all the victories. V'ala melchamos, and all the battles. Shasisa lavasinu b'yimim mehem azman hazeh. Now let's look what he says. So in those days, the Greek kingdom, the Syrian Greeks, actually were the ones who stood up against the Jews. They made all sorts of decrees to get us to abandon the Torah and forget the Torah. To tear us away from your statutes. And then you, through your great mercy, you stood up for the Jews at the time of their troubles. Ravta es rivam, you fought in their battles. Danta es dinam, you went ahead and judged their claims. Nakamtes nikmasam, you took vengeance for them. Masarta giborim biyad chalashim, you handed over the mighty into the hands of the weak. Verabim ma'ad me'atim, and you handed over the many into the hands of the few. Utmeim ba'ad torim, you handed over the impure into the hands of the pure. Urisham biyad sadikim, the wicked into the hands of the righteous. Zaydim biyad oske torasecha, and you handed over all those wanton ones into the hands of the diligent students of your Torah. And you made this great victory happen for the Jewish people. Look at the elements of this Al Anisim. Nowhere did we say we sat back and you saved us. We were there. We were the weak. We were the few. We were that army of the Chashmonaim. We were there. but we recognize the fact that ultimately the salvation came through God. This isn't a prayer thanking those mighty warriors of the Chashmonaim. They did their part. They did exactly what we were supposed to do. They did their hishtadlus, but it made absolutely no sense why they were victorious. They were so undermanned. They were so outgunned by the enemy. They had everything working against them. But we're recognizing that they played their part, and that ultimately that unlocked the door that God could shower us with His blessings. And that's basically what we say in our Alanisim throughout Hanukkah. That we're this is our attitude. This is our worldview about the role, that partnership that we're in with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, about how we have to do His efforts, but ultimately it's HaKadosh Baruch Hu who makes the choice if how He's going to save us, if our efforts will be blessed for success, and sometimes the blessing will come from totally out of left field, seemingly has nothing to do with our efforts, but it is a result of our efforts, because those efforts that we put in unlocked the doors, unlocked the gates that now allowed God to bless us with success. So that is our worldview about understanding that relationships between effort, success, victory, and all that. We have to do our parts, but ultimately we recognize that our success comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and it might come from totally unexpected places that don't seem to have any cause and effect relationship with our efforts. But that's what it's all based on, because once we do our hishtadlus, that unlocks the gates, allowing God to bless us with His success. So I thought that's a beautiful idea of understanding what is it exactly. Where did Yosef go wrong in asking for help from the Sar Hamashkim, from the chief butler? When we know we have to do Ishtadlus, where did he go wrong? He lost perspective of how the system works, and that's why he was held accountable, given 2 more years in prison to try to think about this, think this through, get it through your attitude, get the proper mindset again. What is that relationship between our efforts and between success, understanding God's role, and then just to take a look every day throughout Hanukkah and the Alanism that we say, that lesson is so part and parcel of the Alanism. It's really astonishing just to see that that's there. Okay, that's the first Dvar Torah I wanted to share with you today. And now I want to share a second one. The second one is fascinating, and we're going to see that this is going to take us into a little bit of a trip and a little bit of a trip into Jewish history. Let's see. So a little bit later in the Parsha, after Yosef successfully interprets Paro's dream, and Paro really likes it, resonates with him, the interpretation that Yosef offered. So Paro says as follows: Vayomer Paro Yosef, God has let all this known to you, not just interpretation of your dream, but He also outlined for Paro what his plan was. Now that I told you there's going to be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of terrible famine, and here's my plan for how we can get through this: stock up and build storage houses, yada yada. So all that stuff that Yosef said really resonated with Paro. He says, after God's given you all of this information, so he says, Ein navon v'chacham kamocha. There is no one as understanding and as wise as you. I need you to head this department. You're going to be you're going to be my lieutenant, or you're going to be my co-pilot to get us through this potential tragedy. That's what he tells Yosef. So let's look. I never noticed this before I started. So again, same Rav Moshe Sternbach out of Yerushalayim. He has an awesome observation. So Paro said, Ein navon v'chacham kamocha. There is no one as understanding and as wise as you. There's another place in the Torah where those 2 words come up. And that's in Sefer Devarim. In Parshas Devarim Nemar, at the beginning of Sefer Devarim, in Parshas Devarim, it says, Havu lachem anashim chachamim univonim. Is that Hashem told Moshe, gather around yourself men who are wise and men who are understanding. But look at the orders reversed. You see, when Paro is saying, Yosef, you got a lot going for you, he says, there's no one, ein navon v'chachom kamocha. He put navon, understanding, before wise. And when Hashem is speaking to Moshe, telling him about the shivim zakenim, the wise elders that he should gather around to assist him with his work, he tells him, havu lachem anashim chachamim unevonim. So those same two qualities, make sure they're wise and make sure they're understanding, but he put wisdom before understanding. I never noticed this, that it's the same words and it's a different order. So Rav Sternbach is taking notice of this. And he says, he says, did you catch that? That in Paro's estimation, Paro is clearly saying well, we know what's more valuable by what you place first. So in Paro's estimation, what's most valuable is being a Navon, being understanding, and then being a Chacham, being wise. And Hashem is saying about Klal Yisrael, what our values are, is that no, Chachma comes before Tevuna, that wisdom comes before understanding. So what's going on here? So Rosh Hashanah says, Hiktim chachamim lenevonim. When God is telling us what's of supreme value, he puts being a chacham before being a navon. Sheba'am Yisrael, because when it comes to the Jewish people, kol echad makir ba'afsiyuso klape avosav v'doros kodmim. We all see ourselves as being minuscule to the giants that preceded us, to the Chachmei Yisrael, to those great Jews, those scholars who preceded us. Whoa, I don't hold a candle to them. This is part and parcel of Jewish theology, you might say. We have this concept of niskatnu hadoros. The generations are weaker than they previously were. That might be true physically, that, you think about, those old European Jews we knew who were just like cut from a different cloth. Those guys were just unbreakable, those survivors that we knew, and we're tissue paper compared to them. You think about those people who went shoeless on these freezing cold death marches across Europe, and you think about, oh my God, how few of us would survive something like this. These people were just made of steel. So there's a concept of niskatnu adoros that might apply physically, but it also applies in terms of spiritually, is that every generation that's closer to Sinai, they were in closer contact with the generation before them, of the people who actually were the Dordea, the generation of understanding, who were taught by Moshe Rabbeinu, who stood at Sinai. That was when the Am Yisrael was at its pinnacle. So here we are so many years later, as whatever levels we achieve, it's going to be so minuscule compared to earlier generations. That's part and parcel of the way Judaism, of how we understand things. We need their chachma. We need the wisdom of the previous generations. Based on all their chachma, we could add something. We could add our own insights to, but without their chachma, we're nothing. Lavin davar mitoch davar. We can add our own gifts that we have and our own efforts we put in, but we need them. They're the absolute basis for what we have. Aval Paro, what did Paro do? Hiktim navon l'chacham. Paro, when he's saying about Yosef, what do I like about you? You're a navon, you're understanding, and you're chacham, you're wise. So he's darshaning. What's Paro saying? So that Paro is saying, no, I value tevuna, I value understanding before chachma. Chachma means wisdom that's based on the knowledge of previous generations, and tevuna is what as a contemporary, my contemporary spin on things. Paro's putting in saying, I value tevuna over chachma, and Hashem is telling us, the Torah is telling us, we value chachma over tevuna. Is that tevuna is important, but chachma is the basis. We have to be based on the wisdom of prior generations. She'umos olam, the nations of the world, yodim, what do they know? Shedoros kodmim, that previous generations, lo hayu b'nei tarvus, they were not as cultured as we are today. So therefore, hibanos al tarbusam, we can't build on their culture. We've only grown. You try to tell a kid today, who's got technology that his great grandparents could never have dreamed of, and that kid's holding it in the palm of his hand. I tell him, it comes up every now and then. I said to him, you realize you're holding more technological power in your phone than they had on the lunar missions. The NASA, those astronauts, their lives were dependent on handheld calculations that were being made in Houston. It's mind-boggling, like what's going on. There's more power in one smartphone than all the technological stuff that they had in there. So in other words, he's saying is that if what we're viewing ourselves is that we're constantly developing and we're constantly building and we're just more cultured and we're more technologically savvy. So he's saying that the umos olam, he's saying the nations of the world will put more importance on tevuna, like how technologically advanced are you? How cultural are you? Previous generations were less. That means you're greater. Whereas he's saying Judaism puts more of a premium on chachma, on wisdom, and chachma was always going to be more in previous generations. So this is a contrast. That's why Paro says, "Ein navon v'chacham." There's no one who's as understanding, meaning as cultural and as wise as you. Whereas the Torah would say, no, we want chachamim u'navanim, chachma before tevuna. Let's see what he does with this now. Vishamati, I once heard something beautiful. Me'agon Reb Shimon Posen Zatzal, from a rabbi, a great Gaon who had already passed away, named Shimon Posen. Harav, and I see this word there. I don't know what that word is. The chaperon? Who's chaperon? So let's just pause for a second. Look on the bottom of this page. Here's a brief bio I found online. His name was Rabbi Shimon Yisrael Posen, born in 1894, died in 1969, so he was already dead by the time Rev Sternbach's writing this. And in Hebrew, he was known as Rav Shimon Yisrael Posen, Av based in Viram, and he was the rabbi of a town in Hungary called Shapran. So that was the name of his town. It was Shapran. And you'd see there he was actually born in Frankfurt. So this was someone who evolved. He started off as a Yeke. He was born in Frankfurt, and he moved to Hungary to go to yeshiva. And there he became very, very influenced by the Minchas Alazar, who was the Hasidic rabbi of Munkach. So he became a Chassid. So again, this is interesting because there are Posens in the family that were very, very German Jewish, and so it's just interesting to see a picture of him. But he became a rabbi in Shapran, who was in Hungary, and I don't know if he made it out before the Holocaust or after, but he ended up in New Square. So he ended up in New Square, which is a Hasidic enclave, and he was a Rav there. I think he was on the base in New Square. That's where he's buried. So let's see, what does he say he heard from Rabbi Posen? B'shamati me'agon Reb Shimon Posen, Zatzal. I heard something beautiful from him. Sha'akum medamim motza b'nei adam min hakofim. He says the non-Jews they basically buy in heart and soul into the concept of evolution. Evolution means we came from kofim. What are kofim? Monkeys, apes. So he says those nations of the world that buy, full blown into the concept of coming from apes. Kivan shetzlam doros rishonim kechol shekodmim hayu kain hayu pchusim b'tarbusam. That means every generation that preceded us was less cultured and in effect closer to the apes. Until you go back to thousands and thousands of years, you go back to the cavemen, Neanderthals. These guys. So going back previous generations, it's being downgraded, so to say. Am Yisrael, but the Jews are different. That's not how we view things. We view the earlier generations as being far superior to the latter ones. Look at our most recent, say, generation of rabbinic scholars. They don't hold a candle to the Vilna Gaon and to the Baal Shem Tov. The Haim and the Gaon and the Baal Shem Tov, lo higiu l'malas haBeis Yosef. They don't approach the Beis Yosef, the author of the Shulchan Aruch. V'dor zeh and the generation of Beis Yosef, lo higiu l'madregas haRambam v'Rashba. They don't go to the time. They don't hold a candle to the Rishonim, the Rambam and Rashba. We have this respect for every generation earlier as being so much greater. Ukedoshim mehem hayu ha'amoraim. And what's greater than the Rishonim? The Amoraim, the authors of the Gemara, Vatanaim, and the authors of the Mishnah and the Medrash, Gedolim Amoraim, they're even greater than them. Vanshe Knesses HaGedolah, Gedolim Minataraim, they're even greater. Vaneviim and our prophets, they were greater than Anshe Knesses HaGedolah. And who was greater than the Nevi'im? The greatest of the Nevi'im was Moshe. Harishadoros Rishonim Hayu Kamalachim. That's why we have this idea that we view previous generations as being angelic. Ugavoa Ma'alasam La'in Shir Midoros Achronim. And they're just far superior in their spiritual heights than the latter generations. So he's saying this is a basic point of departure, you could say, from Yahadus to other nations that are out there. Other nations that are out there, they view that humanity is continuing to evolve, and we're growing, we're more educated and more cultured, whatever, more technologically savvy. So why should I be all respectful? And you see this play itself out. You see the way that some people will treat previous generations, and it's very disrespectful sometimes the way they'll treat you got some like old World War II vet. There's very, very few of them left now. And, people will sometimes just, we'll say, my God, like, what those people went through and, what they had to do, the times that they lived through. You can't just look at something so silly, like, okay, he didn't know how to use a cell phone. So what do you mean? But that person's the trials and tribulations that person lived through and the knowledge that person has, they're far superior to what we have, But you can see that people who are just so caught up on something external like this, they say, what do I have to learn from him? What do you mean? What do you? And I'm telling you, see this with kids. They'll say like, "What do I have to learn from that, older generation?" So that's what I want to get to on page 4. So you're thinking like me now. Is that as soon as I saw Rabbi Sternbach quote this from this Rabbi Posen, I'm saying, Rabbi Posen said this? I had always heard this from Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky. Let's go to page 4. Page 4. Oh, there we go. Page 4. Okay, so I'm going to introduce this to you. The first source I'm bringing is someone who heard this directly from Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky's son who passed away. Rav Yaakov had a son, Rav Nassim Kamenetsky, and this is there's a big Talmud Chacham. He's a professional. I don't know exactly what he does professionally. This Eliezer Brot, I'm in touch with him every night, and I'll tell you I was in touch with him this week. But he is one of the organizers behind a great website called the Sfarimblog.com. Sfarimblog.com, they've got some great authors. He's indulged me every now and then with letting me post some stuff on his site, put some articles on there. But it's a great site, and he's a great Talmud Chacham. He's also written, and I've seen his articles in several journals. So he had an article called Visiting Zoos in Halacha, which was fascinating, bringing up all the different halachas that could come up with visiting a zoo. So this is in footnote 15. This was in a section up above where he's talking about monkeys and apes. Worth mentioning related to all this is a story I heard from Rav Nassim Kamenetsky. So he's saying, I heard this firsthand from Rav Yaakov's son about his father, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, who was flying business class from Israel to the States and was seated near Yerucham Meshel. Again, I didn't have time this week to look up much about Meshel, who was chairman of the Histadrut at the time, who was totally secular, but he was a committed Zionist and he was working very hard to help build up Israel. The two were schmoozing. Meshel saw that Rav Yaakov's son and granddaughter kept coming in from the economy section to check if they could be helpful to him. He marveled that there was such kibbud av and compared it to his own situation where his children and grandchildren hardly visited him. Not just on the plane, but he's saying in general at home. They don't call, they don't visit, they don't do anything. So Rav Yaakov answered that since he, Meshel, believes in Darwin, that man evolved from a monkey, there's no reason for them to respect him. They are another generation farther from the monkey. He should be respecting them. He, Rav Yaakov, believed that Adam was God's handiwork, and our children are another generation removed from that glory. They therefore respect someone closer to creation. That was it. So I had always heard this story about Rav Yaakov. And here's one. And then I said, okay, but I know I have a book at home. It's actually a very good book. Art Scroll publishes. This is a very different genre within Art Scroll. There's a couple historical books that Art Scroll published that are excellently researched, like real history books. This is one of them, the one they did on Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, and that's why, because it's pretty much all based on the work of Rav Nassim, his son, Rav Nassim Kamenetsky, who had amassed a lot, and Rabbi Rosenblum, Jonathan Rosenblum, who was here last spring. I think it was last winter, maybe it was 2 springs ago. He was the one who wrote that book. But so I looked this up, and again, but it's based on the meticulous work that Rav Nassim Kamenetsky did. So look what he's got here, this paragraph. He brought down the whole story, and he's got it just slightly different. He says here, you on the other hand believe in Darwinian view of life as a result of random purposeless events, he told Meshel. So as far as your descendants are concerned, you're just one generation closer to the apes than they are. We, on the other hand, do not believe that we are superior to our ancestors. Quite the contrary. For us, the central event in history was the revelation at Sinai. So you see in this account, he's going to Sinai, not going to Adam Harishon, to creation. Right. This is how I had always heard this one too. The generations immediately after that revelation lived in awe of their parents as people to whom God actually spoke, and their children in turn viewed them with veneration for having known those who heard God speak. And so it is with each passing generation. My children and grandchildren honor me as one who had contact with spiritual giants whose greatness is almost beyond their comprehension. Therefore, they attribute to me a wisdom and spiritual sensitivity that they do not possess. And I, for my part, try to pass on to them something of what I learned from the previous generations. I thought it's a beautiful angle. And that's really what that Rabbi Posen was saying. But this ties back to Rabbi Sternbach, what he was saying about Paro's view of Chachma and Tevuna versus the Torah's view of Chachma and Tevuna. Paro was saying, "Ein navon v'chacham kamocha," that you've got Tevuna, and that's what he put first before Chachma. The Torah says no, Chachma before Tevuna, because Chachma is based on our previous generation. We can never turn our back on previous generations, and we have to respect them for having been a generation closer to Sinai. That's that. Now, what struck me about this was that I had always heard this as Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, and it just shocked me that here's Rabbi Posen, pretty much coming up with a very similar thing. So I was in touch with with Eliezer Brot this week. He was the one who wrote that footnote that what he had heard from Rav Nosson Kamenetsky. So I wrote to him, well, good morning, Eliezer. I hope you're well. Totally unrelated to the Ralbag article. I was in touch with him earlier in the week because I was just finishing up a project that I'd been working on about involving Ralbag that I wanted to get published on his website on that Sfarim blog. I'll let you know if that happens. But I said totally unrelated to the Ralbag article, but fascinating nonetheless. Last night I prepared the attached Parsha class to share with my shul tomorrow. See pages 3 and 4. I sent him this handout. I had never before heard this idea attributed to anyone other than Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky. I included your footnote on page 4, as you added that you heard this directly from his son, Rav Nosson Kamenetsky. This week I noticed that Rav Sternbach said over the same idea, albeit without the airplane incident, and attributes it to Rav Shimon Posen, who died in 1969. This made me wonder if, A, Rav Yaakov came up with the idea first and shared it with Rabbi Posen. Remember, Rav Yaakov, towards the last number of years, I lived in Monsey. Monsey's not far from Blue Square. B, Rabbi Posen came up with the idea first and shared it with Rav Yaakov. C, they each came up with the same idea independently. D, someone earlier than both of them came up with the idea first and they each used it in their lives and teachings. Or E, perhaps there's more possibilities. I don't know, but it just struck me as like, wow, like I had never heard of this. Whenever anyone would say something of this nature, I would immediately jump just like Joanne did and said, yeah, there's this great story about Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky. And now here's this, he's saying he heard the same thing from Rabbi Posen. So I don't know. And I don't think any of us will ever, without being able to sit down with Rabbi Posen or Rav Yaakov, none of us will ever be able to get to the bottom of that. But it's just something to just make us think of like possibilities that are out there. Worlds could collide. They could have actually spoken to one another and shared this observation. I don't know who shared it first. They could have got it from some earlier source than them, or they could have each. They were both Chachamim and Nivonim. Both of them were wise, and both of them were men of understanding. They could have both arrived at the same conclusion on their own, and it's just something fascinating to think about. All right. So I hope these are some thoughts that'll enhance Parshas Miketz as well as Parshas as well as Chanukah. I hope this is something that can definitely do that for us. All right, with that, I'm gonna stop the